The Wirtschaftswunder. For many of you, you may be thinking of the German New Wave band from the early 1980s. But for most of you, the Wirtschaftswunder was the economic transformation of Western Germany from a war-ravaged and shattered nation in 1945 to one of the world's strongest economies within decades. So how did this so-called miracle on the Rhine happen? I'm your host David, and this week we are taking a look at the Wirtschaftswunder and the rebuilding of the German economy. This is the Cold War. US military protection was crucial for the German economic miracle, as it allowed Germany to focus on its economy. The sponsor of this video, Private Internet Access, can do the same for you, giving you peace of mind and protection in your online dealings. Private Internet Access is the leading no-logs VPN service with over 30 million downloads. You can count on it to hide your IP address, encrypt your internet connection, and keep you safe online. Plus, Private Internet Access is the perfect solution if you want to secure your downloads or stream your favorite content anywhere in the world. With thousands of VPN servers, Private Internet Access is available for all platforms, from Windows to Mac OS, Android to iOS, and many others. What's more, one subscription protects up to 10 devices simultaneously, and 24/7 customer service is available. If you want to hide your digital footprint, it's time to get Private Internet Access. And by using the link in the description, you have access to a 78% discount. That's less than $3 a month, and you get 3 extra months for free as well. Plus, you're protected by a 30-day money-back guarantee. So go ahead, support our channel, use the link in the description, and sign up for Private Internet Access today. The conditions Germany found itself in following their surrender in May of 1945 are best described as bleak. The country, which had been, for a short time anyway, master of continental Europe, was under foreign occupation, divided into 4 zones, and destruction, disarray, and poverty was widespread. Industrial output was down by 1/3, and 20% of overall housing across Germany had been destroyed compared to pre-war levels. The country's agricultural output was half of what it had been before the war. The impact of the war on agriculture was so severe, in fact, that even by 1947, agricultural output was only 51% of what it had been in 1938. Rationing of food to the civilian population, which had been introduced during the war years, with a cap of not more than 2,000 calories per day, was continued by the occupying forces, and at one point even lowered to 1,000 calories per day. Price controls on goods and services ensured there were constant shortages, and as a result, the black market boomed. The Reichsmark, still the official currency, had lost all of its value, and since it was considered worthless, transactions were conducted using the barter system. Personal belongings became a staple of items traded, but the real king of the economic system was cigarettes. Small, portable, and always in demand, these would be traded for food and other necessities. So Germans found a way to get by, but this had a definite impact on industrial and agricultural production. Businesses had no incentive to produce goods for people who had no currency, specie or paper, to pay for products. Now, we also need to consider the physical state of infrastructure in occupied Germany. Well, to be frank, it was in shambles. Bridges, railroads, electrical and water distribution systems had all been severely damaged either by bombing or advancing armies from east and west. Industrial infrastructure, including but not limited to machinery and production facilities, had been dismantled and confiscated by the victorious armies. Plans were underway to enact the Morgenthau Plan, which wanted to deindustrialize Germany. Originally proposed in 1944 by Henry Morgenthau Jr., the American Secretary of the Treasury, the plan proposed turning Germany into an agrarian state, incapable of waging war. But by 1947, it was becoming apparent that the Morgenthau Plan was likely going to result in the possible deaths of up to 25 million Germans. This was because of poor harvests, the result of a very harsh winter, combined with the fact that there wasn't enough fertilizer available to boost crop yields to sustain the population. And the reason there wasn't enough fertilizer? Well, German industry wasn't able to produce them due to the lack of infrastructure. And they couldn't buy it from abroad due to a lack of money since the economy had largely collapsed. Not wanting to be responsible for the starvation of millions, the Allies walked back the Morgenthau Plan, and large amounts of food imports from the United States were offered instead. Now, at the same time this was going on, the German economist Walter Eucken was speaking out, stating that a barter economy was incompatible with a proper division of labor, and that Germany, in its immediate post-war period, had been reduced to a primitive condition. And he was right in many ways. One only needed to look around Germany to see that the conditions present in the country were very rough. Major cities like Dresden and Berlin lay in ruins. Köln, that's Cologne in English, had seen its population drop from 750,000 to only 32,000 people. Millions of men of working age had either been killed or were no longer able to work, either through injury or being held in prisoner camps, not only in Germany, but across Europe and even North America. So all this to say, the German economy was in need of drastic transformation. And this is where the Freiburg School of Economics enters the picture. This school of economic thought, of which Eucken, who I just mentioned, is considered one of the founders, promoted the concept of Ordo Liberalism. This is the idea that market economies are best for a country provided they are combined with significant state protections to prevent monopolies and oligopolies from forming, since those not only stifle market growth, but can also transform their economic power into political power. Eucken was a huge proponent of Ordo Liberalism, combined with a social welfare system designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society. He was also a vocal advocate for removing price controls, and instead replacing them with a strong, independent central bank which could keep prices stable through monetary policy. And of course, it wasn't just Eucken promoting ordo-liberal ideas for economic reform. Ludwig Erhard, a prominent and vocal anti-Nazi who was selected to head the Sonderstelle Geld und Kredit, the Special Office for Money and Credit, in the Western zones of occupation, was also a strong proponent of Ordo Liberalism and the Freiburg School. Erhard would go on to become not only the West German finance minister under Konrad Adenauer, but also chancellor himself, so clearly his economic policies were bought in. Now, that being said, not everybody subscribed to the ideas of Ordo Liberalism. The Social Democratic Party, its economics guided by Dr. Kreisig, advocated for the continuation of strong centralized economic direction and price controls, fearing that an open market would result in the total collapse of the German economy. But Erhard, Eucken, and the Freiburg School prevailed, and the way towards recovery was paved. To start, a new currency needed to be introduced. The Reichsmark, seen as worthless, had no trust from the German people. Production continued to fall, but due to price controls, the selling price of goods was not allowed to increase, which would normally stimulate production. This combination of stable prices and falling production is a phenomenon known as repressed inflation. As early as 1946, Wilhelm Röpke, another prominent member of the Freiburg School, stated, "The prerequisite of a return to economic sanity in Germany is the radical reform of the German money system. This reform must restore the mark as the true measure of values, as the trusted means of exchange, and therefore as the agent that harmonizes and integrates the economic process. To this end, the repressed inflation must be stopped by two measures at the same time, the one hitting at repression, the other at inflation. There would be little sense in making an end of the repressed inflation if we were to retain the strangling devices of economic repression and go on directing, licensing, prohibiting, and whatnot." So, on the 21st of June 1948, a new currency was introduced into the Western occupation zones. The value of the new Deutschmark was 93% lower than the outgoing Reichsmark and Rentenmark, meaning that in one day, the German people who held Reichsmark or Rentenmark had lost 93% of their wealth. But leadership also understood that it was not just a new currency that was needed. So, coupled with the new Deutschmark was the removal of price controls. The artificially low prices that had been set removed incentive for manufacturers to produce more products. The worry by many economists, however, was that by removing price controls, that prices would then rise dramatically, preventing consumers from being able to purchase anything. As a side note, these price control reforms were unilaterally introduced by the German administration on a Sunday, since the administrative offices of the Western occupying forces were closed on Sundays. The Germans were afraid the Allied Control Commission would countermand the reforms, so by announcing them on a Sunday, they managed to pull a fast one. And that wasn't the only reform that was introduced along with the new Deutschmark. Tax reforms were also implemented. Corporate tax rates, which had ranged between 35% and 65%, were brought to a flat 50%. Personal income tax rates were also reformed. In 1946, the Allies were applying a 95% tax rate to those earning more than 60,000 Reichsmark, which would translate to about 6,000 Deutschmark after the new currency came into effect. After the taxation reforms, this 95% tax rate only applied to those earning more than 250,000 Deutschmark. To consider more common wage brackets, in 1950, where the median income of a West German worker was 2,400 Deutschmark, the marginal tax rate was 18%. That same median income under the old tax system would have been subject to an 85% marginal tax rate. So what did the tax reforms do? Well, it allowed the middle class to grow and even flourish. It also, however, meant that the upper class paid higher taxes and put more into the system. And the effects of these reforms? Well, transformational is probably a good description. Seemingly overnight, shops began to have goods as people understood that the new currency had value. The black market largely disappeared, and bartering became obsolete once again as money, specie and paper, became the prime driver of economic activity. Manufacturers began producing more as the lifting of price controls meant that it became profitable to produce goods. And how about a concrete example of the benefits of the reforms? Well, in May 1948, the month before the reforms were introduced, Western Germans, on average, missed approximately 9.5 hours of work per week, time which was used to search for food. By October, however, as foodstuffs were far more readily available, that number had dropped to approximately 4.2 hours per week. Another example? Well, in June of 1948, as the reforms were introduced, industrial production sat at approximately half of what it had been in 1936. By the end of 1948, it was 80% of what it had been at the same time in 1936. And output continued to grow in leaps and bounds. By 1958, industrial output was more than 4 times the projected annual rate based on the 6 months in 1948 preceding the financial reforms. Industrial production per capita was 3 times higher. Okay, now I know some of you are already yelling at me and are typing furiously in the comments section that the West German recovery was more than just a new currency. Like, what about the Marshall Plan? After all, the perception among many is that the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, West Germany included. So let's take a look at that. We really do need to preface this part to say that in the early post-war period, Americans generally were not keen on rebuilding Germany. The Morgenthau Plan is a clear example of that, and well in line with the desire to not only prevent Germany from ever waging war again, but also as a punitive action. But, and there's always a but, it soon became apparent that there were clear risks to this approach. Concerns grew that the disarray, poverty, and general hopelessness would be an excellent foundation for a flourishing communist movement that could, or in some minds would, result in the Sovietization of the entirety of continental Europe. So Germany would be included in plans to assist the rebuilding of Europe. So how significant was the aid provided? Well, there was actually not as much given to Germany as is often believed. The total amount provided by all aid plans, not just the Marshall Plan, was about $2 billion through to October of 1954. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a huge amount of money, but when put into the perspective of the size of the German budget, it's less grand. During the peak years when aid was being provided, 1948 and 1949, Marshall Plan aid still amounted to less than 5% of Germany's national income. It was still, of course, massively important for Germany's recovery, as it helped provide that additional support to both the German government and its people through a very difficult and sensitive time. It helped to reassure Germans, the ones in the West anyway, that the Western allies were there to support them. There is some real hardcore Cold War stuff here too, but we'll get to that in a second. Marshall Plan aid also gave Germany extra ability to build an export-focused economy. Since Marshall Plan dollars were also helping rebuild other economies in Europe, German firms saw the opportunity to use their central geographical position to produce goods for export to their neighbors, thus further strengthening the German economy by forging ties into new markets. Keep in mind also that the economy of Western Germany had been intrinsically linked to the eastern portion, and with the loss of access to that portion of the country, new markets needed to be found. Interestingly though, European nations weren't the only foreign markets that Germany sold into. From the middle of 1950, war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, and Western-backed South Korea found itself in need of foreign industrial production, which the West Germans were happy to provide. It's estimated that German industrial production rose by over 30% as a result of supplies being sold to support the war in Korea. Those of you who have watched our episode on the Japanese economic miracle will quickly pick up on the idea that the communist invasion of South Korea played a huge role in the recovery of two Western-backed market economies. Now, we also need to consider that Germany was still responsible for paying reparations for the war. Overall, the German bill was for 30 billion Deutschmark, a tall order for a fragile economy, no matter how quickly it was growing. By the early 1950s, the Western coalition was moving past its wartime animosity towards Germany. Well, the West Germany anyways. Given a choice between countering the threat of communism and continuing to punish the perpetrators of the Nazi regime, the West chose communism as the greater evil and moved to befriend and integrate Germany fully into Western power structures. As part of this, the 1953 London Agreement of German Debt was signed, which agreed to reduce the wartime debt by 50%. It also allowed for the debt to be paid back over a 30-year period, and even then, payments only had to be made if Germany was enjoying a trade surplus. Even further, repayments were limited to 3% of export earnings. All of this meant that West Germany had little difficulty in meeting their debt obligations, and by 1983, payments were completed. So, all of this to say that when discussing the German economic recovery in light of Marshall Plan aid, we do need to keep in mind that Germany was still responsible for paying its debts. It just so happens that they were easily repaid, with only minor impact to the economy due to a combination of strong economic growth as well as very favorable terms. Okay, now for the hardcore Cold War part of this. The aim in 1945 from the occupying powers had been to find a way to remove Germany's ability to wage war in the future, but there was no clear agreement on how to go about doing this, so the occupation just continued. As costs began to mount from supporting the German people, the Western occupying forces made the decision to allow economic reforms to begin rebuilding the German economy in the Western zones. This was opposed by the Soviets. Stalin made the decision to try and force the Western Allies to give up their economic plans and their enclave in West Berlin by blockading the city, the Berlin Airlift. The 11-month air relief mission by the Western Allies to support West Berlin convinced the Soviets that the West would not back down. Within weeks of the lifting of the blockade, two new states were born, East Germany and West Germany. Further to this, the Western Allies had made a decision that the threat they felt posed to them by communism was greater than their animosity towards their former Nazi enemies only several years prior. An economically strong and independent West Germany was deemed necessary to help the West stand up to the Soviet Union. This was the decision-making that brought West Germany fully into the Western sphere, including eventually a full member of NATO. Of course, all of this episode has been focused on West Germany. The West German economy grew and strengthened and became a global powerhouse. But what of East Germany? What happened to its economy in the post-war period? well, it too got a new currency, and it too stabilized and provided jobs and produced goods, and traded with its neighbors, but in a totally different fashion from the West. And we are going to take a look at that, but it's going to be in a different episode where we can look at it with the time and attention it deserves. We hope that you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss that future episode on East German economics, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have introduced monetary reforms, allowing you to press the bell button easily and freely without having to spend almost 10 hours a week trying to find the damn icon. Once again, a shout out to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video. Use our link in the description to get complete digital privacy for $2.59 a month and get 3 extra months for free. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. And don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it gets heated.